Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Paul Doyle. I'm the General Manager of Rail Freight and Ports with the Australasian Railway Association. It's my pleasure today to welcome Rebecca Pickering, the Director of Engagement, Environment and Property at Inland Rail. She's going to talk today about how to develop and maintain social licence, which I think is very timely. For those of you not familiar, Inland Rail is a fairly significant project, 1,700 kilometres, 3 states, 36 local government areas. So no shortage of issues and no shortage of challenges in terms of developing and maintaining that social licence. So if we just go to the housekeeping issues, I'll just quickly run through. So just a reminder, I guess, that this is recorded and will be available within 48 hours. And also our intention with these sorts of webinars is to make them fairly interactive. So Rebecca's going to run through a bit of a presentation, but if there are any particular questions you'd like to ask, then feel free to do that. You just need to click on the question in the speech bubble, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. So we'll have a session at the end of this presentation to go through questions. But look, that's the formalities out of the way. I'll hand over to Rebecca now. Welcome.
Thanks, Paul. It's wonderful to be here. And firstly, as well as saying hello to everyone that's on the webinar today, I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. For me here in Brisbane, we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I would also like to acknowledge any Indigenous people here on the webinar. Look, I thank you all for your time. And I'm hoping what I cover today will stimulate some questions at the end, as Paul said. So, don't be afraid to log some questions. I think it's a really important topic, social license, a really interesting space. And anyone that's working in the sort of rail and broader infrastructure industry should have some level of understanding about the topic, but it's not always a clear-cut issue. So I think there's always room for some good discussion. And as I always say, certainly in previous roles and here at Inland Rail, social license is everyone's job. It's in how we show up in literally everything we do in our projects or in our operating businesses. So whether you're joining the webinar, from the discipline of, communications and engagement, or engineering, finance, environment, procurement, it's great to have you here. I think everyone has a role, in the social license of our industry, and obviously of your own respective companies. And, delighted that you can join. Just to give a little bit of background about myself, prior to being with Inland Rail, I spent over a decade in the Queensland coal seam gas sector, which in itself could be a controversial industry, and the community had some, very genuine, substantial concerns about that industry. And so it's interesting to sit here today and reflect back on, the genesis of that industry and how far it came, and the social license ebb and flow, ups and downs that went through. But I look back with pride that through positive engagement and looking for points of collaboration, that industry was able to secure the social license that it needed to move forward. And that industry is now a cornerstone of those local economies, the state economy, and indeed Australia's national economy. But on the flip side, coal seam gas, has not necessarily had that same journey in other states or in other countries. So it does remind us that social license is not something that we can take for granted. It requires work, and really that's what I was keen to talk to you about today. And some might say I'm glutton for punishment, but then getting involved in another major infrastructure project, that's got some fairly substantial impacts, and they are the nature often of infrastructure projects. But I think it's really important that, we reflect back on the successes that we have had and know that with planning and preparation and engagement with our stakeholders, we can really do some great things. But before I dive too far into social license, I did just want to talk about the Inland Rail project itself. And look, I find the best way to talk about it is through looking at this map. And as Paul briefly mentioned, 1,700 kilometres connecting Melbourne to Brisbane. And the clue is in the title. It goes through an inland route rather than, the alternative of going along the coast if you wanted to get between those two capitals today. And just to call out some of the communities for those that maybe haven't got the eyesight a bit like me. The key communities that goes through it really goes past a huge number. From Melbourne, it passes up through Wangaratta, Albury, Wagga, Junee, Parkes, Narromine, Gilgandra. Big shout out to Gilgandra. I think they're dialed in, as a Narrabri, another one of our communities on the route. Moree, Toowoomba, Millmerran, Gatton, before heading into Brisbane. So it really has a huge connection with so many of those key inland regional towns and cities. And what else shows up in this map is those faint blue lines in the background, which really represent the state rail network. So this backbone that we build between those two capitals, creates the opportunity to bring those regional towns closer to their markets and really reduce transit times from a regional community to the port or a capital city. The other thing that the map calls out really in the difference in its colours between the yellow line and the purple line, the yellow lines are brand new greenfield sections of track. So that's about just over a third of the length is new greenfield. And the rest, the purple lines, are upgrades to existing train lines. But those upgrades in some cases are very substantial. Full removal of the embankment, a full rebuild with all brand new sleepers and rail. Some of those purple sections are upgrades which would see bridges being lifted or tracks lowered to accommodate the trains that we're intending to run on Inland Rail, which are 1.8 kilometres in length and double stacked containers. And I'll get to more about that in a moment. So, I think one of the things that we also talk about is, why aren't we seeing more freight on rail at the moment? There are some challenges with the efficiency and that transit time in moving goods between those two capitals. But if we put Inland Rail into the picture, what we can catalyse, as we see the freight task in Australia, which is forecast to more than double over the next 30 years, which is just an alarming statistic when you think about the road congestion and the investment that we'd have to make in terms of roads. We would get some, modal shift anyway onto rail in moving forward. But once you put Inland Rail into the equation, you really make a step change in that transition to rail. And with that comes significant benefits around reduced congestion, more safer roads, and reduced emissions. And the key to that, as I mentioned, is a lot about the transit time. So that coastal route really is about 33 hours of transit time at the moment, as it wiggles sort of up the coast and has to traverse through Sydney, which can be quite congested, and passenger trains, getting priority. So the vision is to have that fast, safe, straight and flat line connecting those capitals to allow transit in under 24 hours, and ideally for express trains, under 22 hours. And if we can run trains in the modes that I described, those very long double-stack containerized trains, we have the opportunity to, dramatically improve the cost effectiveness of rail as a mode of transport and really generate that shift. And that's why you hear us often talking in the design of Inland Rail about the importance of the transit time. It is fundamental to so many of the decisions that we make. Everything that pushes us further out time-wise can certainly erode those economic benefits. A lot of people ask me about whether Inland Rail will ever be built, and they're often surprised to hear the answer that actually Inland Rail is already under construction. Only one section at the moment, one of those purple sections, one of the big upgrades. There's a 100-kilometre section between Parkes and Narromine, and so some of the benefits of this project are already flowing, as some of the contracts that have been let show. And we're not very far away from awarding a second major contract for the section Narrabri to North Star. So North Star is not far away from the Queensland-New South Wales border. So the project is really starting to pick up momentum. And the beauty of some of these stats are that a lot of that spend is actually occurring in regional parts of Australia, which is wonderful. And just actually diving in specifically on that Parkes to Narromine project, as I say, that's very close to finishing construction. We've had, and good credit to our partners, InLink, our construction partners, brilliant levels of sustainable job creation, and really wonderful levels of local spend. So lots to be proud of, and setting ourselves up well for a model where we can really engage communities positively, and particularly given that they wear the brunt of those impacts of infrastructure build. It's important that they can see that there is upside and opportunity that will come from that construction. And in fact, when you actually go to Parkes, it's a wonderful story. You only often have to go into the pub or onto the high street to see, fairly thriving economy there. Parkes has recently had a special activation precinct announced, but the local businesses are getting on board. The sentiment is really positive. And I think that's one of the key sort of takeaways, that when you can see those benefits start to flow, you can, there's enormous positive sentiment. And it tends to be more in the planning phase where you can have less answers to questions and a bit more uncertainty about the project, that you can see those social license challenges really emerging. And one of the things that I thought I'd share as well is obviously a bit of a vision towards that future. We're forecasting very strong jobs growth or jobs creation through the project and spend. And whilst we're not in construction at the moment in Queensland and Victoria, there's plenty of opportunity that's really not that far away for those communities. Okay. I might slip onto the slide. Just thinking about social license, and one of the things I often have is a huge amount of questions about, what is social license? And I need to sort of say for the start, I am actually an engineer. I'm not a social scientist, but this is my area of interest, and I've spent my majority of my career working closely with engineers, helping them get done what they, need to do, which is generally building stuff, but acting as a real interface between the business and the community to work through opportunities and communicate issues and allow a real two-way dialogue. So in thinking about social license and the questions that I certainly get internally, we all have a lot of experience to draw on, both in our professional sort of capacity, but also when we look at the world around us. And one of the things that I've noticed with social license on the projects I've been on, or in world events that go on, is that issues can often be very localized, and you can start with relatively even sentiment, but when sentiment starts to erode, often it will only take one event before suddenly you have a lot more stakeholders drawn into the situation with a negative sentiment. That's really what this slide is depicting. So if you think even just about some of the national issues that are going on, where we've seen social license impacting corporations or regimes, you can see sort of in the most extreme cases, overthrow of government. If you think back to classic examples in history around, the French Revolution, or more recently the Arab Spring, small things, and a gradually eroding sentiment can suddenly take a rapid deterioration, triggered by one event. And the most recent case clearly has been a lot of the Black Lives Matters movement, where where there's an underlying current of eroding confidence in governments, police forces dealing with situations of deaths in detention, and then you get an event as happened in the United States, that suddenly causes a situation to escalate very rapidly. So that's one of the sort of the things that I've seen in a number of social license issues, so where you see that gradual erosion and sudden rapid decline occurring. And what it says to me is we need to be clear who our primary stakeholders are, who is that group that you need to be keeping very well engaged and informed, so that you've got that strong platform of sentiment, which means when things do happen, unfortunate things happen, you can, maintain your social license and inoculate, in a way, yourself against things that might literally, stop you in your tracks. And this is just a 4-quadrant tool that I use as well to try and understand, what is the system that we're working in sometimes, and I'll explain it through talking about engineering. I love a good 4-quadrant model, to be honest. We often have engineering problems, that we're challenges that we're facing, and we have, they're described in my mind as being complicated. As hard as they may be to solve, you can ultimately solve and predict the outcome, because we're reliant on the laws of science, principles of physics. So if you apply the knowledge that you have, you can analyze the situation, and you know what response you're going to get if you build something, design something. It's a very predictable framework that you're dealing with. But when you're dealing with people and communities, you're really dealing in a complex environment where you can't always predict the outcome. Outcomes aren't always repeatable, and that can be quite a challenge. So with engineering, you know that if you apply your knowledge and take an action, you know the response you're going to get. But in a complex environment where there are communities, and often with, naturally quite heightened emotions because of infrastructure impacts that may be happening, then we're pushed towards taking action where you would essentially probe, understand the situation, learn from a real feedback loop, and then plan your next action. And that's really, that probably wouldn't come as a surprise to many, but it's, a key difference sometimes when we're talking about in corporations. We often want to know the outcome that we're going to achieve by our action. And in dealing with communities, that can mean that we have to take action without knowing the outcome. And that can be difficult to sanction, particularly if your reputation is on the line. But often taking no action can be, actually a worse outcome. So there are two things that we've sort of chatted through there around actually understanding who are your most proximate stakeholders that you need to keep well engaged to ensure your underlying sentiment is not not vulnerable, and also thinking about the fact that to engage your stakeholders and deal with the complexity of community dynamics, that, we need to take, small steps, understand the outcome, and then continue to plan. And at the nexus of that, I think, is where local knowledge is so fundamental. I think this is the place where those that are most proximate to our projects have something that many others don't have, but that can offer to the project, and their specific local knowledge and understanding. And the more that we can reach out to those communities and harness that knowledge and allow those most proximate stakeholders to influence our projects, and generally that leads to better outcomes too, then I think for me that really is the sort of the nugget of trying to define a course of action around social license, defining those stakeholders and really engaging them strongly to harness, what they can bring. And whilst it's, Inland Rail has had some, challenging times, it is actually sometimes difficult to get to that stage. What we have experienced on our particular project, when I sort of apply that theory and look retrospectively back at how we've done, it has really been a challenge. The project by its nature had such an enormous number of stakeholders in the initial stages of the studies that were done over many decades. We often didn't have the opportunity to have those one-on-one conversations. And I think, what is pleasing today is that we are now at that stage where we've, increasingly defined the project. We've narrowed down a corridor, and so we're clear exactly who the directly impacted stakeholders are, and really now actively in that stage of gathering that information for them and seeing, a much more engaged community and I think an improving sentiment towards the project, which is wonderful. So thinking about it then for broader businesses, it's an opportunity for me just to share our social responsibility framework with you. Now, this is specific to Inland Rail, but it's not that different to, what many other businesses use. And often these frameworks, need to be different in different businesses, just given, what you're seeking to achieve or what your project is about or what business you're operating. But we really go with, 3 core themes about being visible, building credibility, and building trust. And if you can tailor your engagement and initiatives around those 3 core areas, then that's what I think can help set you up as best as possible in that social license space. In terms of what specifically, is Inland Rail doing, we've got 4 areas that we're currently focused on in terms of initiatives that play into those high-level principles. So we've got a lot of work going on in terms of building infrastructure skills, allowing communities the opportunity to interface with our project, get training, understand how to also connect regional businesses into the supply chain so that they can gain opportunities. Naturally, we're doing regular and timely community interactions, and we also have a focus on building confidence in our engineering. So I might just step through those in a bit more detail. Certainly in terms of infrastructure skills, I'm actually, this is probably one of the areas I'm very proud of the project at the moment. We've been rolling out a program of training up in the Moree and Narrabri in partnership with those councils and the state agencies and a number of local, training organisations that are really seeking to assist local businesses in the region, understand how to become part of a major supply chain. Also skill building around, how in a mega project, what the expectations are about, HSE requirements, and just building skills around writing proposals and tenders. And complementing that, we're also seeking to support individuals build their own skills as well. through ensuring that we're helping people get tickets for the sorts of job categories that will be coming up, and also even rolling out STEM programs in schools. This is actually quite a long project running through to 2026. So some of the people that will work on the construction of our project are realistically still at school. The other area that I touched on was about community engagement. And again, another area I'm very proud of Inland Rail. We've taken a real step towards employing staff local to the alignment. And I think we're seeing now the benefit of this. We've got over 30 staff based, at various places up and down the alignment. And in terms of that accessibility and that visibility that I spoke about, this is really paying dividends. I think we're hearing more of that feedback and that local knowledge that we were seeking, and making sure that we can fully incorporate it. So certainly a model that for a regional project, I think this is a key thing, a key learning and a lesson that I would pass on to others around, harnessing, the capabilities of the people, in those localities, to work as part of your team. I think I've spoken about regional benefits and regional legacies, but we do have a program, looking to support the communities themselves, in continually sort of invigorating their own initiatives, so supporting through, sponsorships and donations, programs like rural fire services, the men's sheds, local events that are really fundamental to the fabric of the community and allow us to contribute positively, but in a way that really empowers the community to do what it is that is most important for them. And then that final category about building confidence in our engineering, we're working with, a huge number of, world-class partners to do the very best engineering that we can. And that is really where we've been able to, and I really would like to acknowledge, the input that so many of our stakeholders have had in terms of providing us with data. Some of the graphics there on the screen are screenshots out of our flood modelling, and that's been one of the key areas that the community has expressed concern quite rightly about, the risks of that we might exacerbate flooding impacts, and being able to harness the community knowledge, feed that into our models to inform them and calibrate them, has been invaluable, and ultimately helps us building confidence in those models and the engineering that they inform. And finally, just can't stress enough the importance about getting out to the kitchen table, being there, being accessible, listening to the issues and being responsive, providing the information that's available, being candid about the impacts, and supporting people to engage wherever possible, and being truly responsive and empathetic. That's probably the end of what I want to say, but I'm more than happy to take any questions. There was a fair bit to digest there, a bit of theory, a bit of information about Inland Rail, but Paul, I might hand back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Very interesting presentation, and I guess we'll open it up now to anyone who's been watching who has some questions. Feel free to fire them through. We've got plenty of time to answer some questions. I guess I might kick it off, Rebecca. I guess you've just outlined the sheer sort of size and scale of the project, and that goes through multiple different sort of jurisdictions. I guess, how do you reconcile that, and how do you manage what at times I guess can be some conflicting sets of interest from different stakeholders? How do you sort of juggle all that and keep on top of
it? Look, it's a great question. You're right, it is a juggle. That there are lots of competing, desires for the project, and it's, I think we have to be realistic that we simply can't always meet the expectations of all. I think we just sometimes have to listen and acknowledge, and do what we can. I think certainly the lesson for us has been, having jurisdiction-specific teams, that are really focused on the needs of individual states. Whether it's focused on the approvals that we need up front, or just collaborating with those state governments about how our infrastructure will fit in their broader infrastructure network. So there's lots and lots of interfaces with state agencies. It takes a lot of management, but I think we recognise it's truly key to the success. And yes, there are robust discussions that have to occur, but I think I think what's helped there certainly has been sharing the vision for Inland Rail and the opportunities that it brings. I think can often bring us closer together and resolve those areas of disagreement in a fairly positive and pragmatic way.
Yeah, great. Another one, it's a bit more specific. It's just asking about the process, I guess, of landholders in terms of if you are accessing their land, is there a bit of a process that you go through to compensate, or what's that process look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, in this form, I won't go through the nitty gritty. The short answer is absolutely yes. There is a process, and it's one of the things where we do really need to collaborate with the state governments. To acquire land for a rail corridor, we do need to use the sort of acquisition powers that belong to the state. So we are really beholden to the processes under state-based legislation in the way that we engage with individual landowners to explain the impacts, talk them through the process, and ultimately come to the point of negotiating the impact and the compensation that they are entitled to. We're at that stage on a small number of projects, but you're right to flag it as an area of interest because it is one of the key questions that we get. We haven't commenced acquisition of, on the majority of the line as it stands at the moment, but clearly it's something that we recognise as an area of significant interest for many. It's also something that we need to get right as well. So we need to make sure that we have finalised the design. And remember, we're still in reference design. We really want to make sure the design is sufficiently mature before we move into that next stage of those compensation discussions. But they will be very closely monitored and reviewed by the state whose powers we would be accessing.
Excellent. Thank you. And I guess you just talked a little bit about the processes. I guess more broadly, I guess you're at the front end with some of the environmental approvals processes and going through sort of multiple local, state and national approvals processes. I guess any observations on the process, and I guess extend it to your long involvement with some of the significant coal seam gas developments in Queensland as well. Having observed the processes over many years, are there opportunities to improve or refine how we collectively do environmental impact assessment? And I guess from both a government point of view, but also an industry proponent point of view as well.
Yeah, look, it's an incredibly topical question. I think I'm trying to think. How many weeks is it? Is it 2 or 3 weeks since? We've had some fairly significant, announcements by government about, the intent to really fast track approvals of projects. And as a proponent, that's music to my ears in one sense. But on the other hand, we need to make sure that we are following due process. We do need to allow time for the community to digest the design and comment on the EISs. So I think we do need to be really clear that when we're talking about that fast tracking, it's more about in the administrative component about is there more that we can do to cut down the time it takes within some of those agencies to turn around. And again, that's not necessarily an easy nut to crack at the moment, but it's great that the dialogue has certainly started. between all of the states and the Commonwealth and key industry components. So I feel like there is a weight of sentiment about making, really catalyzing that change and really challenging the time frames that we need to apply to big projects.
Yeah. And I guess the key thing for me when I've been thinking about it and we've been talking about it internally, I think fast track doesn't necessarily mean shortcut. They're not one and the same. So you can fast track things without necessarily losing some of the rigor and the process that you need as part of an EIS. So yeah, it's good that there's a dialogue happening on it, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes, I guess.
Absolutely.
So look, a specific one here, and if you don't mind, I might get you to go back to so there's just a question here about the employment numbers. So that slide where you had the employment numbers, I'm just wondering if you can, yep.
That's quite all right. No dramas. Let me go back.
I just want to make sure we get it right. And so the question, it's basically saying were there thousands of new jobs created and just over 50 of those held by women. Might have read the stats wrong. Let's just, so I think it might have even been,
yep.
Was there some earlier?
That should be coming up on your screen in a second, hopefully.
That's,
yeah. Yes, that's on the Parks to Narromine. Yep. Sorry. Yep.
Yep. So I guess they were just questioning the some of the numbers. So, I mean, maybe if you just spend a bit of time sort of taking everyone through those sort of specific numbers there, and that might answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely. These really, these are snapshots, as at end of June for the Parks to Narromine project. That's that large, about 100 kilometre long brownfield project where we've sort of removed the entire embankment and existing rail line and rebuilt it to a much higher standard. The key stats that I draw out from this slide are, the sustainable jobs numbers. So we talk about 833 sustainable jobs, and there's a little bit of definition there around what do we class as a sustainable job, because it differs to that sort of that number at the top, about 1,800 people have worked on the project. That's people who have, even maybe just, a day's work where they have come and, maybe set up some compounds or, a couple of days' work. And the 833, that's people who have been employed, consistently over more than 26 weeks, so over half a year, for a minimum of 15 hours a week. So it's essentially providing them a sustainable primary source of income for a period of 6 months or more. And that's really where a project like ours, is making a lot of impact. That number above, although much larger, that involves a lot of people who just had to work for a day or two doing something, quite specific. The other things I would call out is just the sheer number of local businesses that have supplied to the project. 99 local businesses, of which, and we have, 9 Indigenous businesses with those respective spends shown underneath. So, we've just ticked over that $100 million mark of local spend, which is, really phenomenal. And a credit to InLink, our partner, who have put in a phenomenal effort to ensure that local businesses have had really genuine opportunities in that supply chain. And in terms of the other stats, there are stats there about tradespeople, women. We've got Indigenous employment figures there as well. So all round, I'm quite proud of the what we've been able to achieve. But if someone's got a specific question, happy to field that if there's something specific to call out there.
No, look, I think you've answered that particular question. I just thought if anyone else had any questions about some of those numbers, that just taking them through it like you have is quite useful to put it all into context, because there's a lot on that slide and a lot of people that have benefited and a lot of money that's been spent. So it's good to understand that in a little bit more detail. Next question is just in relation to, I guess, the process around community engagement, and an observation that someone's made that it's often just seen as a little bit of an add-on and not an essential part of project delivery. I guess how important is it to have that early engagement and have have people have a seat at the table early in the planning sort of phase of these big projects?
Yeah, I think you can't understate the importance of it. I mean, I think with one of my slides, I was trying to explain the challenge that Inland Rail faced in that particular regard, because the footprint of our project was so and is so huge that getting into very detailed conversations early on was a challenge for us. But I absolutely agree. You need to involve the local communities as early as possible. Harnessing their information will just improve the quality of your design work. And and from my perspective, that's good business and good sense. But what also sort of sits behind us, is the stick of the regulator that is actually saying, if you are not doing adequate engagement with the community, and you're not demonstrating how you've responded to their feedback, then that they're going to be having a bit of a chat to you as you approach the publication of your EIS to say, have you actually done enough genuine consultation, and can you demonstrate how your design and ideas and the mitigations to your impacts, how have they been influenced by the community? So it's good business sense. But even if you choose to ignore that and do it, the regulator will scoop you up and get you in that place anyway.
Yeah, look, that's exactly right. Certainly, the social components of environmental impact assessments have become much more prominent and do pick up those sorts of things. I guess the other challenge as well sometimes is the level of knowledge and information that you have around the alignment. And I think, in my experience on some linear infrastructure projects where you're seeking approvals, if you go to them to sort of understand what their values are and try and incorporate their values in terms of refining that alignment, you run the risk of consultation fatigue at the other end as well sometimes, and it's quite a fine sort of balancing act, I guess, in terms of getting that level right and giving them good sort of succinct information along the way. Just a question here in terms of, and I'm happy to sort of chip in a little bit because it sort of aligns a bit with some of our the work that ARA is doing. But I guess, can you just elaborate a little bit more on potentially some of the benefits that might sort of flow to the ports in particular? So this one's in relation to New South Wales, but it's probably appropriate to sort of talk about the connectivity and what it might actually sort of do to the supply chain as well.
Yeah, absolutely. If we look back at the at the map,
yeah, that's a good one to look at.
This map tells 1,000 stories in my mind. In terms of those benefits, and if you're talking about to the ports, that the key is that regional communities will have choice. Through that regional network that exists at the moment, often a farmer in northern parts of New South Wales, for example, have really only got one choice, and that's to send their goods to, Newcastle, for example. With the introduction of Inland Rail, and one thing I didn't call out, it's just getting too much information, is that the Inland Rail is dual gauge in Queensland, so so it can still accommodate the current Queensland norms, but it doesn't stop trains from interstate coming into Queensland. It just means that grain could be loaded in northern New South Wales and then make that choice: do I go to Newcastle or do I go to Brisbane? So so there's true opportunity to bring in further competition between the ports, and really sort of stimulate more efficiency there. So that would be my comment in terms of the ports, and just generally in terms of shortening the distance, essentially by at times being able to cut sections of that regional network out. You can get, just reduce the transit time to ports, full stop. Just again opens up another choice for farmers. Do you want to push to an export market, or are you just are you just going to sell your goods internally within the domestic market? So I think it's only a good news story there from my perspective. And yeah, more broadly, the benefits, I think tried to call them out, but that reduced congestion on the roads, the sheer job numbers. There have been studies done by the Commonwealth government that talk about, after the arrival of inland rail, it will catalyse further growth in those regional towns in Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. New industries that will take time, but that are the studies show that it will catalyse new trade hubs, new intermodals, and you can start to genuinely think about more manufacturing being done in regional areas where you have the ability to move sort of raw materials around much more efficiently and at lower cost. So in a way, the sky is the limit in some ways. And the original business case for inland rail paints a very positive picture about the net economic benefits that come. So $16 billion of net economic benefits for Australia, as was shown in one of those slides. And I think the further studies that have been done have actually only demonstrated that there's conservatism in that, and that there are more opportunities that are yet to even be realised.
Yeah. And look, I think the other bit from my perspective is that slide that shows the shift in modal share that inland rail brings. I mean, that's something that the ARA are really pushing for. We're looking to get more freight on rail. It's really important to us. There's a lot of work that we're doing in terms of research about how we get that. But without something as significant as inland rail to really, give the system that jolt, and then, provide those opportunities, it's very, very difficult. So it really is a critical project for rail freight going forward. Just a question around the building trust element, and maybe I think you sort of talked about that in your slides, but if you can just sort of elaborate on, I guess, how do you really engender trust with various different communities, and what sort of processes can you try and go through to really build that trust?
Yeah, I think building trust really comes down to, I think, doing some of this, the simple things well, but it's the meaningful things. So, internally, when we talk about, engendering and building trust from the community, it's the stuff like just keeping your promises, meeting expectations, just being fair and equitable, and treating people with respect. Those are all sort of just how the feedback we get from the community is that that's how they want to be treated, and it's what will allow them to accept you more into their community and build trust, and that takes time. And certainly my experience in the gas fields was that took years and years, but years of showing up, just being open and honest with the facts and the information, explaining your decisions, and just being respectful to their perspective, even if it didn't align with your own. I think that goes a long way to building that respect and trust between a proponent and the community.
Yeah, no, that's great. Good advice as well for anyone that's developing projects. I guess related to that, there's a sort of another question around the sorts of tools or metrics that you might use during, the actual delivery phase of the project, so that you, in effect, track yourself as far as honouring your commitments. Anything underway or in place in terms of some of those ideas?
Yeah, I think those naturally will evolve further. As we get further into construction, the things that we are measuring, will start to differ. So, but there's a whole suite of lag indicators that a project of our size and would track. So whether that's sentiment, or simply things like the number of approvals that have been secured, the number of land acquisitions or negotiations with landowners that have occurred. So there's all those sort of lag indicators that you would fully expect, that demonstrate what is the product of your efforts, and have you got is it showing up, your social license showing up through those metrics. I think the challenge is often then more what are the lead indicators? How do you know whether you're actually at risk of ending up with a bad outcome in those lag metrics? And that is more difficult. And actually, I had a meeting with my team yesterday about that very thing, to actually say, what is it that we're going to, challenge ourselves? Because some of those are quite difficult metrics to measure, but, we have to have a go. Trying to understand, a lot of it is about ensuring that, I guess in that slide where we're talking about identify your key community, your proximate stakeholders, and give them your utmost sort of focus and concentration. So a lot of the metrics we were talking about were ensuring that, that we're absolutely, prioritizing those stakeholders, ensuring that they're being kept regularly updated and informed, that we're responsive, that we're closing out issues that they're raising, following up. And some of that feels like general kind of housekeeping, but it's actually that which is at the very heart of how you do build, the foundations, I think, of the positive relationships.
Yeah. And related to that, someone's just asked, is there an example of where local knowledge, community feedback has really sort of shaped or influenced the project? And whether it's inland rail or maybe some of your other experiences with Origin, have you got some examples of that you could share?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, plenty of examples from the gas fields, and but I won't dwell on those too much. But certainly in terms of inland rail, we've got a number of working groups, for example, down in Victoria, where we're really collaborating on urban design. So actually, it's many and varied. Is this project? We've got train lines that are literally going through the centre of rural towns, and then much more sort of across paddocks and farming property. So real diversity. But in Victoria, where it's more in the sort of urban areas, we get a lot of feedback about the urban design components of the project. And we've actually set up a number of community working groups, because I think some of our first efforts and attempts didn't hit the mark there, and we needed to find a better way to, come together with the community to understand their desires, but also to manage some expectations of, what was truly within scope. But I think in setting up those dialogues, it's allowed the community a level of influence that has made them feel more comfortable. And certainly, in other areas, where have, stakeholders influenced design, we are regularly out there seeking and incorporating data from landowners. So, our flood modelling is one of those areas which, has been, under, scrutiny, and, there's been some criticism. But, we have been using the data provided by the landowners to feed those models. And then that in itself then shapes the design that we end up with in terms of the number, the sizing of the culverts, where we make a change in the design to move from culvert embankments, embankments with culverts, to actual bridge structures. So very much, the community's had a huge influence there, particularly in those major floodplain areas, where we've ended up with substantially more bridging structures than in the very first iterations of the design. So you can really see the evolution of things over the course of the last sort of 18 months. There's been quite substantial changes in key areas of the design.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of that anecdotal evidence is often very important, isn't it? I guess the citizen science component of it, and it gets people involved in the process as well, which is always really good. I guess we've got a few minutes left now. I might just sort of finish up with a broader question, maybe just in terms of what's next for you and the team and Inland Rail going forward, and where's the the sort of focus areas in the coming months and years.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the stage of the project that we're at, we've got a big raft of projects that are nearing the end of reference design, and we'll have EISs out for public consultation sort of between now and the end of the year. So and so there will be a huge amount of work generated off that to take on board all of those comments. Make the necessary adjustments and then allow conditions to be set and negotiated with the regulator. But what it really signals is we'll be thinking ahead to the next steps where we get into detailed design, which means more interaction with stakeholders, but also getting ready for big procurement activity, which takes me back then to some of the examples I provided earlier around getting those communities aware, and the local businesses, local individuals, skills accredited or whatever's required, so that they can take part in those projects. So I'd say we've got a big work of EIS, bringing all of that approval stuff together, and then ensuring that we're absolutely ready to get to market and support the communities to engage in that supply chain, find the jobs, and find the business opportunities. And that's a big task in a project of this scale. We end up with still some very, very large tier one contractors often, and then tiers of subcontractors underneath that. So pushing down that vision and sentiment, and creating the right incentives for our contractors to ensure that they are maximizing opportunities for local individuals and businesses is a key part of what I'll be focused on for the next 12 months and beyond, once we get into construction.
Excellent. Well, thanks for chatting to us. I really enjoyed that, and I think everyone who's dialed in hopefully got some benefit out of that. I think we've answered most of the questions that we could within the time frame. So again, thanks to Rebecca. And if you're interested, then as I said before, within the next 48 hours, we should be able to provide those slides, and just keep an eye out on our website. That's where they'll be available. The next webinar actually is next Friday. It's a Meet the Buyer series. So if you're interested, get in touch. But until then, goodbye for now.